was putting this unit together, I wanted to begin with a quote about memory that really captured just how important it is. I think it's impossible to exaggerate how central memory is to human existence, really. And so I remembered this quote from a Spanish film director that I had been exposed to for the first time in college, named Luis Buñuel, one of the most influential and acclaimed directors of the 20th century. And this is what he said. He said, "You have to begin to lose your memory, if only in bits and pieces, to realize that memory is what makes our lives. Without it, we are nothing." And I think you will have to agree that without your memory, it's really difficult to say you are still you. How could we be ourselves, be the person or the people that we are, if we don't have a memory? So it's incredibly important for all of us. And we're going to see in this unit, it's way more than what you usually think of when you consider what memory is. It's far more complex. It covers far more topics than you might expect. So a little introduction before we kind of jump into the major topic for today, which is what is memory and memory encoding. But let's just define what memory is. To be sure, it is a very broad topic and a broad concept. Luis Buñuel's quote, "Without our memory, we are nothing," partly hits on this next point, that our own autobiographical memories, that's just one part of memory. You know, when you have memories of your childhood or what you did last week or who your favorite musicians are. That's just one part of your memory. It's a lot more than that. Another aspect of memory is amnesia. Most people have heard this term amnesia. Amnesia generally means you forget some portion of your life, but it could be forgetting the past. You had an injury to your brain and then you couldn't remember anything that happened before that. But you could also have a type of amnesia like HM had, where he couldn't form new memories. In the most tragic cases are people who can't do either one of these. But then there's another type of way of looking at memory, and that is explicit versus implicit. So an explicit memory, an example would be like, who's the president? What day is it? What's 7 times 6? Those are all explicit memories, things that we literally, like, objectively, concretely, explicitly say or express. But implicit memory are all those sorts of things that we know and that we remember, but we don't necessarily say it out loud or implicitly. That would be like the skills that we have, our ability to speak our native language. You know, if you know how to make a cake from memory, that's an implicit memory. How to ride a bike, people's names when you see them and that's Freddie or whatever. And then there are semantic versus episodic memories. Semantic memories tend to be things like who was our first president, like facts, versus episodic memories, which are events. What was your first day of school like freshman year? Do you remember what you did last summer and what you were doing? That's an episodic memory. And there's lots more beyond just these intro topics, but that's just a little taster. An overview of our chapter. Today we're going to be talking about the nature of memory and memory encoding in this brief video. But there's also the notion of memory storage. Where does the information in our brains go? How is it stored? How does that work? Memory retrieval. Yeah, we have memories in there, but we need to be able to get them and use them, retrieve them. And then there's forgetting, the kind of opposite side of the coin to memory. Okay, so let's define memory. First of all, the word memory refers to this ability to recall something. It could be a past event, or it could be an image that you're thinking of, like picturing someone or picturing something. It could be an idea. It could be a previously learned bit of information, how to get to the nearest Arby's, for example, or a skill, how to play the piano. All of these things tap into your ability to recall something. But the word memory also refers to not just this ability, but it's also a storage system that allows you to retain and retrieve the information that you've already learned. The first part of memory is encoding. This is getting memory into your brain. Then comes storage, which is holding it, and then retrieval, getting it out. And there are different types of retrieval. One would be recall, like you remember something for a test. You have to fill in the blank or write an essay. That's using recall memory. Recognition would be something like multiple choice. Or you see 4 people come into a room and, oh, that was the guy who I met last night. That's recognition memory. Some of the major questions about memory are things like, how do we get our memory from our sensations, from what we're hearing, and how does that get into the brain? How does that become a memory? How does it ever get into our other systems? And then what decides what's remembered and what's not? Remember, we are exposed to tons and tons of information every single day. And some of it we'll remember and some not so much. What's the deciding factor typically? Attention. It's essentially impossible to remember something if you aren't paying attention in the first place, which is why I make kind of a little spiel about it at the beginning of the year. One of the most important things you can do to do well in school is to pay attention during class. It all begins there. So how does the memory process begin? Well, here is a little chart for you. Feel free to pause the video and copy it down or use the version that's in the text. Sensory input, whether it's something we read, something we hear, smell, any kind of sensory input, because we're drawing in things from our environment. That goes into our what's called sensory memory. And this is where encoding happens. And it requires attention in order for that information to get into your short-term memory. Imagine someone witnessed a car accident. They were walking down the sidewalk and they saw a car accident and someone was involved in a hit and run. They crashed into someone and then just took off. And, the police show up and ask you, did you see that? Did you see a license plate? What do you remember? Well, in order to produce that license plate number, you'd have to be paying attention to it. And usually you'd have to be really intentionally trying to do that because it's not something that people would just kind of accidentally remember. When things get into our short-term memory, the way to keep it in the short-term memory is through a process called rehearsal. Rehearsal meaning it could be repeating that license plate to yourself over and over so you remember it if you don't have something to write it down with or you don't have your phone with you to take a picture. And then that information gets into storage. And this is where your long-term memory comes in. And then from the long-term memory, when we're using that information, it goes back into your short-term memory, and that is the process of retrieval. So today, we're going to just focus on the encoding portion. So what do we mean encoding? Basically, it's taking the sensory information and putting it in a form so our nervous system can process it. And this comes from visual sources, auditory, olfactory. Hopefully you remember what that one means. That's your sense of smell. Any of our different senses can encode things. Attention is really important when it comes to encoding. If something is going to get in the first place, we've got to be paying attention to it. And divided attention interferes with encoding. Many studies have shown that people have an incredibly difficult time multitasking. Everyone thinks they're really great at multitasking, doing 2 things at once. Sorry to break it to you, but it is not true. You would definitely do better if you didn't do that. Your attention can't possibly be on 2 things simultaneously and do both equally well. And then another important concept is called levels of processing. So you're sitting in class listening to me tell you something. One thing you could do is just sit there and listen and hope to remember it in the future. But another thing you could do is possibly ask a question to get clarification, or you can write it down and take notes. Those things are deeper levels of processing. The brain encodes information that you take in different ways, and on different levels depending on how you are interacting with that information. Deeper processing leads to deeper memory. So if you're just sitting there listening, that's one thing. Sitting there listening, writing it down, maybe writing questions along with it to kind of get you to think. All of those things are an example of different levels of processing. When it comes to the brain and encoding, we know that from PET scans and fMRIs, positron emission tomography, and functional magnetic resonance imaging from Chapter 2, we know that encoding happens in a couple of important areas. The first is your prefrontal cortex, and remember that part is right up there in the front of your brain, basically the part that is right directly behind your forehead. The left prefrontal cortex is more likely to be encoding new information, new memories, while the right prefrontal cortex is going to be doing more with retrieving old stuff. All right, so there's your prefrontal cortex, and there's also the temporal lobes. And in particular, that area that's kind of highlighted there in pink on the side, that's called the anterior medial temporal lobe, and that's for encoding associations, which is connections from or between different pieces of memory, different bits of information. Every memory you have, as we'll see even more so when we get to storage and retrieval, every thing that you have in your memory is part of a large constellation of information surrounding that particular bit of information. So here's a little example of how encoding works, or you could also say how encoding doesn't work. Even though we've all seen way too many pennies to possibly even begin to count how many times we've seen a penny, can you actually pick out the penny that's actually a real penny from these 12 different pennies? It's very difficult. Most people can't do it. If you're able to figure it out without cheating and looking at, a penny, you are in the minority. And I will reveal it in a second. The reason we don't remember something, even though we see it every day, is because we don't process it very deeply. We see it and we don't pay much attention to it. In terms of levels of processing, we're not like looking at it, reading it out loud, talking about it to someone else. That would be kind of unusual. So we're not going to remember maybe all of the subtle details of a penny. If you did realize which one it is, again, you are in the minority. So, are you ready? Number 4. And maybe you got it. And if you did, good for you. Another way we can encode are through little tricks called mnemonic devices. These are little tricks that we have that help us to retrieve things, but also to encode. There are countless examples of mnemonic devices. One of the ones that I learned back in elementary school music class was the one for remembering the lines on a musical staff, e.g. BDF. Maybe you remember Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge, or Empty Garbage Before Dad Flips. There's a lot of different versions of that, but those are the two main ones that I remember. There's also the one, maybe you know this, especially you athletes out there, treating sports injuries. There's a grain used to remember what you're supposed to do if you sprain your ankle or something like that. You remember that? RICE. Rest, ice, compression, and elevation. Maybe you remember this one. How to remember the names of the Great Lakes. Holmes. And then one of my favorites. So this came from my first year teaching, and a student introduced me to this brilliant mnemonic that I had never heard before, but I am going to share with you. And once you hear it and once you are aware of it, you'll be much better at identifying the state. When people are asked to fill in or identify the states on a blank map of the United States, we tend to do okay in the Northeast. We're pretty good at the New England states. but a lot of people really struggle in this part of the country. Like, for example, do you know what this state is? How about this one? Well, I'm going to give you a little trick to remember that. Think of this guy, Chef Meemaw. Chef Meemaw lives in the middle of our country. And once you see this, you will never be able to unsee it. Chef Meemaw lives right down the middle of the country, and it'll help you to remember the names of these states. There he is. Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas, and Louisiana. Chef Meemaw, one of the best mnemonics. That is it for this brief little video. Thanks for checking this out. And remember, if you have any questions, bring them in and let me know. Thanks.